Hello everyone, my name is Caitilin Studdert. Welcome to our webinar. We're going to commence in just one moment. We'll just allow everybody to join. It's a privilege to have you with us today. Excellent. I can see that the number of panellists is rapidly increasing, as is our number of participants. It's lovely to have you all join us. Hello, and thank you for joining us on the chat this evening. Welcome everyone to our webinar on Agile Operating Models, Lessons from Leaders. My name is Caitilin Studdert. I'm from ADAPTOVATE, and we are so delighted to have so many people register for this webinar. I'll begin tonight with a brief housekeeping message. Our webinar will be recorded and we're keen to make it as highly engaging as possible. So please post questions as we proceed in the chat box. All participants will be muted until our guest speakers are asked questions this evening. And our company, ADAPTOVATE, is built on feedback for continuous improvement. So please fill out our survey posted in the chat at the conclusion of our conversation. So why are we here? At ADAPTOVATE, we have the privilege of co-designing agile operating models alongside our client leadership teams, and we're often asked how other leaders have navigated their way through development and rollout. So today it's our honour to be joined by three special guests who have kindly agreed to share their leadership insights with our global audience. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you Emma Kerr, who is Head of Strategy and Operations from Visa, UK and Ireland. Thank you, Emma. Joining Emma is Liam Ward, who is General Manager, Transformation and Agile Delivery at Woolies X, the digital, loyalty and e-commerce arm of Australia's largest retailer, Woolworths. And finally, we're joined by Darren Moglia, Marketing and Digital Chapter Lead at Westpac Bank. Westpac is Australia's first bank and oldest company, one of 4 major banking organisations in Australia. Welcome to all, and thank you to those who are saying hello in our chat. It's a joy to have you with us. So we have a shared knowledge, and that knowledge is that we know that leaders globally understand that operating models need to be designed to withstand disruption, to be scalable for growth, and to be cost efficient. And the focus of today's webinar will be to ask our panel what they've learned throughout their agile operating model design. We have 3 agenda items. First, we have a brief overview of agile operating models from our ADAPTOVATE leaders, so that we're all aligned on what we're here to talk about today. Then I'll ask each of our guests 3 questions purely to begin the conversation. Finally, though, I will ask on your behalf questions posted by the members in this forum, in the chat. If you have a question for a specific panellist, please feel free to use their name in the question so that we can direct it appropriately. To begin, we'll hear from Michal, our Managing Director from our Warsaw office. Then Paul McNamara, ADAPTOVATE's co-founder, Managing Partner, and Senior Advisor to the Boston Consulting Group, will provide his overview. Paul's been involved with over 15 operating model transformations, so let's get started. Over to you, Michal, to introduce the typical Agile journey.
Thank you, Kate. Hello, everyone. Implementing Agile Operating Model is typically a scaled exercise. It starts with a readiness assessment aimed at understanding what is going well and what are the key enablers for fast delivery. Once the assessment is completed, organizations usually move quickly to pilots. They want to start practically gathering feedback, so they set up a few teams. This feedback is important to test and adjust the new approach before scaling up. Once sufficient feedback is gathered, organizations need to take a decision if they want to launch a broader enterprise-level transformation or not. We call this moment a tipping point. It usually requires buy-in from senior management of the company. Eventually, companies must decide how agile they want to become. Some can even go for a holistic approach, taking agile as an overall way they look at their businesses. Time-wise, it can be very different for different companies. Some organizations go through this process pretty quickly, while for others, it can take several years. Let me now give the floor to Paul. He will talk more about Agile Operating Model, what it is and why we implement it. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Michal. If we think about what an operating model is, it's really a way that we determine how we organize ourselves to deliver on our strategy using the principles of agile ways of working. What it's not an organizational chart, or it's not just an organizational chart. It's not typically highly prescriptive of you must do X and Y, and it's not about putting people into boxes. It's more than a traditional organizational design strategy, which typically starts with an org structure, people in boxes, and minimizing spans and layers. The real question is, why do we do this? We typically don't move to agile because we want to be agile. We move because we want to be more efficient, reducing operating costs. We want to create career paths to retain and attract the best talent. We want to get alignment across the organization to move faster, more efficiently. We want to have transparency around what our teams do so we can fund and put the right priorities in place. And lastly, we want to really have focus around delivering value for the customers, the things we do to deliver value to those that we most care about. And this is not a one size fits all, but there are many companies that are making this transition more broadly to using agile as a principal way they make decisions. This can be anything from financial institutions. We've got Visa, Westpac, ANZ, ING, for example, where a lot of this has started, to more traditional companies, oil and gas, mining, pharmaceutical companies, and retail companies overall. The one thing that is important to know here is that they all may approach their transformation very differently. But what I'm going to cover now is some of the key principles which I think underpin all of them. And one of those is around the principle of alignment enabling autonomy. So this really comes of how we break the nexus on you either are a micromanager or you're an empowering manager. And so if we think about this, with high alignment and low autonomy, we have the situation where, if we need to cross the river, go build a bridge. We're clear on what we need to do, but we get direction on the how as well. If we think about the other spectrum, high autonomy, but low alignment, we walk around, geez, I hope someone's working on this river problem. What we want to do is we want to break that nexus of a choice where with high alignment, we will enable high autonomy. We need to cross the river, so go figure out how. And this is key around separating the what we want to deliver with letting the team and empowering the team finding the most innovative way to deliver the how. And to make this work at scale, we've found there are typically 7 enablers to make this work at scale. And if you think about these things, these are the elements you put in place around teams. So it doesn't feel like the organization is beating up teams and making it hard for them to work. The first one is around a broad alignment on purpose, setting up our quarterly business reviews, being clear on why we're doing stuff, what are the outcomes we're measuring on, often using OKRs, objectives and key results, to really be focused at that quarterly cycle of what are we delivering this quarter. The second one is around certainty of team and funding. How do we get certainty of the team to deliver a specific outcome? All the research shows it takes about 3 months for a team to become effective working together. So how do we change it from, I've got something to do, how do I find the people to go work on that? Breaking up the teams every 3 to 6 months to, I've got a solid team which works really well together and I bring work to that team. So if you think that the change in thought is rather than bringing people to work, we bring work to teams. Then we need to think about, well, how do we structure our teams to have autonomy and collaboration at the heart of what they do, aligning teams around customer-centric missions with flat structures so we can be really clear on providing that autonomy to have end-to-end control over a customer outcome. Number 4 is how do we empower our people with authority? That's getting the right roles. For those that are more familiar with Agile, the product owner role. Let's be clear around what we're empowering that product owner to do. The chapter leads, for example, but also defining new career paths to really value mastery in the organization, those functional skill sets where we really need to become experts to be the best at what we can do. Number 5 is around setting up the growth mindset culture with embedded test and learn to allow transparency around how we are testing, be outcome-based, data-driven over opinions, and get the right leadership behaviors to support that test and learn. Number 6 is what most people would traditionally think of as Agile, although it's more than this, but it's the sticky notes and stand-ups and things like that that most people think about. But how do we do that with a real focus on iterative delivery and delivering things to market that we can test really fast? And lastly, number 7 is around the flexible architecture and integration. Most would normally think this is about technology architecture. Yes, it is, but it's also around how do we create modules for business architecture as well to share best practices and share learnings across the organization. And all of these are needed to really think about Agile at scale. However, there are 4 areas which we find that organizations typically focus on first. The first 2 are autonomy and collaboration and empowered people with authority. This is around how we define the organizational structure of what's the capability and where the work gets done. And the second one is really around the broad alignment on purpose, getting alignment to making sure we're working on the right stuff. And if we think about autonomy and collaboration and setting up the organizational structure, this is around typically separating capability from delivery. So how do we think about getting the right people in place with the right capability, focused on building mastery, and then getting the right work done? And I think key to separate these 2 things is separating the politics of the discussion. So if we think around capability, this is typically the reporting lines. So what we want to do, we want to get rid of the discussion or focus the discussion on capability rather than who reports to who. And the next one is really focus on where the work gets done, that delivery component, to making sure we design our teams on where the work gets done as a one hat, we're all thinking of one business, and getting the right cross-functional squads to deliver on those end-to-end tribe missions. And I think one of the key of changing this around is separating that conversation is to help you speed through the process. And this is a conversation you would typically have every couple of years when you refine or remove the impediments and improve your model as we go. The next element is around the quarterly business reviews. Essentially, how do we align holistically for planning in a rhythm that is more focused on the next quarter's delivery? But this is not just about next quarter. We typically start with annual planning. So what you'd be fairly familiar with doing today. But what we tend to focus on in annual planning is capacity. How do we set up the capacity for the teams to deliver? Typically based on a return on investment. So we are going to give X dollars to teams to deliver Y outcomes. And that return on investment is what we're willing to spend on that team. So once you've had your fights around who gets what money in annual planning, it's only done once, you move into a quarterly cycle where you focus more on what is the right things to be doing, not the constant battle over whose team gets the bigger, whose teams gets the resources. So the real unlock for this is really making that conversation, are we working on the right stuff? And this typically starts with a top level view on what's important, called a QBR memo, where we manage what's important, typically done through objectives and key results. That's then given or cascaded down to the teams to do plan, often in big room planning, where the teams work out how are they going to deliver on those objectives over the quarter. The teams come back, refine, revolves the dependencies, the risks and everything else, and we refine the QBR memo, which is essentially the blueprint in prose, written in prose, similar to the Amazon type principles of write it down. It's the only way you get a shared understanding of, which is then cascaded to the teams of why we are doing. And I think the key thing around QBR memo is not just focus on what we want to do, but focus on who's it for, what do they want, and why is it so important? And with that, we create a shared understanding of how the teams deliver and what the teams need to do to deliver. And so we get the teams to deliver. Obviously, there's either monthly or mid-quarter check-ins to check we're on the right path. Often when you first start on this, the checks from finance and strategy tend to be a bit more focused. But as you go, these check-ins become a lot more fluid discussion of, are you achieving the results you expected to do with the work you're doing? And that continues sort of every cycle. Ideally, you have some movements at the end of the quarter to check what we're focusing on for the next quarter, but these are minimal movements. The annual planning cycle is where you sort of do, let's say, the more bigger movements of people across the organization, which, as we know, every time you move someone, you're disrupting a team. So hopefully that gives you an overview of the sort of the key elements which we look at typically first in an Agile operating model.
Thank you, Paul. A fantastic overview. So next to our discussion panel, our very highly valued leaders. Let's hear some lessons from organisations who've already started on this journey. And may I ask Emma, Liam and Darren, if you could explain your role within the organisation and tell us a little bit about your company's decision to move to Agile. Emma, may I hand over to you, please? That'd be great to hear from you.
Certainly, Caitilin. Thanks so much for having me. So my name is Emma Kerr, and I lead strategy and operations for the UK and I of Visa, or at Visa, which is one of the largest payments companies in the world. And just to check, Caitilin, can you hear me all right?
I can hear you perfectly, Emma. Thanks so much for checking.
Marvelous. So we really had 3 reasons for choosing to go Agile. The first is that the pace of change is just accelerating. It's true for all industries, but especially for payments. Excuse me. And we also wanted to make sure that we were optimizing our resources effectively. So as Paul was mentioning, Visa is a big matrix organization, just like most other big companies. And as such, you can have people sitting in a part of the organization that's working on a lower priority initiative. And what Agile allowed us to do was to bridge those teams to focus on the most important initiatives. And then the third reason was that we wanted more faster and more client-centric decisioning. So again, as Paul and Michal and Caitilin have mentioned, Agile encourages both accountability with more clearly defined roles, market testing early and often, and governance so that decisions can get raised faster to senior leadership. So we viewed this as a really key reason for implementing Agile into the way in which we operate.
Absolutely fantastic, Emma, to hear how this all began. And thank you so much for that great introduction. Liam, may I turn to you now and ask for your insight, because I know so many of the people who've joined this evening are very keen to hear about your experience within the Woolworths Group and specifically Woolies X.
Absolutely. I think for us, we've been on an Agile journey for about 4 years. So in 2017, with a big focus on growth in our e-com business, we decided to merge our key digital assets and businesses under one umbrella and called it Woolies X. And from that point now until now, we've seen quite a significant growth in our e-com businesses, our loyalty business as well, and overall digital assets. So for us, we initially started our Agile journey back in 2017, which was all around the tribal model and just getting and putting our feet in the Agile world. And then around December, I think literally probably a year ago, right, Paul? We invited Paul to come in and talk to our executive team to talk around what's that next evolution of delivery for us. And then we asked ADAPTOVATE to come in and help us with that, because what we were finding was that as we were growing as a business, we started to see some unnecessary silos occurring across our business, and we wanted to make sure the whole essence of Woolies X was to deliver at pace, focused delivery, and a consistent approach to that. So for us, we definitely saw our agile transformation, partnering with ADAPTOVATE, being critical to absorbing the amount of growth that we are now seeing in our business.
Thank you, Liam. It's so great to hear that from you directly. Thank you for joining us today. And Darren, may I ask you to introduce your role and the big decision for Westpac to embark on this journey?
Thank you, Caitilin, and hi, everyone. So I look after a number of chapters and also have led the Agile transformation for our division, which is about 400 people within Westpac. And the types of roles in that division are marketing, digital, teams who look after things like our online banking and our mobile apps. And so an environment where there's a lot of change. And so really the two key drivers for us were, first of all, we saw strong evidence globally, but also we ran a number of pilots within Westpac that demonstrated to us that this is a more effective way to work. And I think we're kind of at a point now where if you're a company that is in an environment of change, or you're a company that wants to move forward, there is a global body of evidence around the benefits of Agile. And so we certainly saw that coming. The other thing was, as Emma touched on, just the amount of change around us. And so what we're finding is that if we wanted to tilt between business units or priorities, we'd often have to restructure our team or move people between roles, and it just wasn't working anymore. And so we started piloting just over 2 years ago with a number of squads and progressively bringing on squads. We then decided about 12 months ago to go all in with our division of 400 people. And so we had ADAPTOVATE partner with us on that, and Caitilin and Paul were on that team who helped lead it. And you know, probably the best example I can give is with COVID this year. Within 2 weeks, we tilted 50% of that workforce, so a huge number of people, from the work they were doing, the squads they were in, to focusing on COVID. And that was about basically putting together packages to support our customers. And so what we saw in that 2-week period is we effectively collapsed a number of squads, stood up new squads focused on the COVID support packages. And then we also were able to look at the backlog of the previous squads and prioritize only the most critical things to fit that 50% capacity. And it happened really smoothly in 2 weeks. And I honestly just don't think we could have done that had we have not made the move to Agile.
It's an incredible story, Darren. Thanks so much for sharing that, because I know all of us have had an extraordinary year throughout the pandemic, but to hear that firsthand and how quickly you were able to mobilise is quite inspirational. Thank you. To our participants, may I encourage you to post your questions in the chat, because there is such a wealth of information we have from Emma and Liam and Darren here, that we would welcome your direct questions so that we can try and respond. But in the interim, I just have 2 questions for each of you, which are quite specific to the point of the journey that you're at. Emma, if I could ask you initially, how do you think business agility links those big priorities you talked about and strategy to execution? Yeah,
so I think we're much more nascent in our Agile journey compared to where it sounds like Liam and Darren are at Westpac and Woolies. But what I can tell you is that before you even get to Agile, you have to have a really strong strategy, because you have to know where you're going. I think Paul mentioned at the very beginning, but Agile doesn't change what you do, it just changes how you do it. And so unless you know what your end game is and where you want to go, you won't be able to harness your people and corral them in the right way to know what they should be driving. That said, I think once you have that strategy and that end game defined, there are a couple of things that we found to be helpful, at least in the last 3 months, which is when we really started this in earnest. But the first is simply to commit, right? To make that decision as a senior leadership body to move forward in this capacity, and appreciate that you're always going to tweak and tailor it for your own needs. Agile isn't really a one-size-fits-all. And so for us, we made the commitment as a leadership team, and then we announced it as a part of our all staff, as a part of the strategy, and clearly connecting the two of, hey, this is where we're headed, this is where we want to end up. and here's how we think we're going to get there. And I think that was really powerful to have both tied so closely and intrinsically together. And the second is training. Again, luckily we were fortunate to have Michal and Slav help with Visa at ADAPTOVATE and train us in a common language that allowed us to start changing the way in which we engaged with one another. And luckily, again, Visa has really strong core values and I would say a really rich culture of continuous learning. You can see things on Visa University and other places that are emblematic of that. But that was kind of an undercurrent that's there and that I think is really necessary to have employees take it up with gusto. Because at the end of the day, Agile is only really as effective as your teams and as much as they want to drive it. And so that training was really, really critical. And then the third piece was setting up a governance around this to assure that, senior leaders who had bought in had visibility of the work that was being done. And I think by that sheer visibility, it kind of forces the accountability of all the business owners that lead projects. And it also encourages faster decision-making so that hopefully things don't get caught in middle layers of the company. And that they get elevated quickly and that direction can be provided, in short order. So again, Agile doesn't change what we were doing. It just changes how we're doing it and hopefully, to Darren's point, allows us to respond much faster. But I think you do need a clear vision, you need senior leader buy-in, and you do need a culture and a set of employees that are keen for the change.
That's fantastic, Emma. You mentioned that the leadership was very aware of some of the values of Agile and they were very closely aligned, I understand, to Visa and your own leadership values. You also described very eloquently the visibility and the accountability that comes with setting yourself up this way and teaming it initially with the strategy conversation. Would you say, in your experience, that they're the key benefits of this new way of working that you can see? Have you seen a change in energy, or what's the feeling in the lounge rooms of the Visa employees?
Those virtual lounge rooms these days. Unfortunately, I wish I were in Australia. It seems to be much better. UK still a bit more virtual, but we're getting there.
We're thinking.
Yeah. No, I think you've nailed it, Caitilin. I think the two benefits that I really see as outcomes of this, outside of getting to where you want to go faster, is the governance, which allows people to make decisions and allows senior leadership to make decisions. But the work and the people driving it are the entire working teams. And that's really important, that it isn't a top-down kind of decision that's been made. The end game has been defined, but how you get there is really delivered through the working teams, and that's a highly empowering thing. It's a bit of a virtuous cycle. And we're also testing a lot sooner. So we're encouraging folks to start testing products with clients before we might have previously been comfortable with. And again, I think that allows us to course correct along the way in a way that's will hopefully make sure that we get to the right outcome. And then the second is accountability. I think both Liam and Darren mentioned the idea of a shared vision and a shared goal across those teams that are coming from various parts of the organization. But the other major benefit that I found is that when you do sprint planning, the concept of sprint planning is really just a best practice. It's to force the owner of the project to think 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 weeks out and understand how that work, how the work needs to build on itself to get to the outcome. And it's something that we probably don't do enough, but what it allows us to do is to say, right, if you have to do a segmentation analysis, you probably need somebody from strategy. Right. If you need to do a user journey, you probably need somebody from product. And it then allows you to both be more thoughtful about the work that's being done and to structure it in a way where you can pull in the right people with the right capabilities.
It's such a great observation, because capabilities is such a critical part of the design that we focus on when we first start. And it's marvellous that you've drawn upon that. And you've also mentioned in some detail the planning element, which is a magnificent segue, with your permission, Emma, to ask Liam a question, because Liam, I appreciate you wrote on LinkedIn recently that you were thrilled to host your first virtual big room planning event. There's a marvellous video that you posted, and even though your teams are working apart, the pace and shared team spirit was quite electrifying. Which brings me to the question of, Liam, in your experience, how have agile alignment mechanisms like big room planning improved the way you have delivered or hope to deliver your business outcomes?
Thank you, Caitilin, and I also love to concur with what Emma's just said as well. I think for us, the QBR, we call it the QDC because, you know, we want to be a little bit different, I guess. We've added a little bit more to it in terms of what works for us. I think it's been a fundamental shift for us, and I think we're seeing that already with not only the focus in our own business, but certainly at a group level in different areas of our business. I've spent literally the last couple of weeks engaging with our teams across Woolworths Group around our quarterly delivery cycle, because for us, it's unlocked a significant amount of things. Firstly, transparency has been a real key driver for us. Empowering our tribes and our squads to be able to effectively be funded for an entire quarter and then go forth and deliver at pace has been a real key unlock for us. And probably the biggest benefit for us in our QDC process has been alignment. So whereas we would, prior to our launch and our transformation journey, we would generally prioritize and we would build our plans at an executive level and get an executive alignment. Now with our QDC program and our cadences, we're aligning across the board. So 1,500 plus team members coming together virtually to plan their work is a significant shift in culture for us. So the way that we operate at the moment is we have a quarterly business review plan. So our business owners will come in and they will present their plans for the next quarter. What are their strategic themes? We reflect on the work that we've done from the previous quarter, and we bring in our leadership team, not just at an executive level. We have our agile coaches in there. We have our key leadership team there in terms of our practice leads and our tribal leads also, and our support team. So our transformation, strategy, finance, and people teams all coming together to really get an understanding and alignment on the overall business and how each of our individual businesses within WooliesX are going to, what their focuses are for the next quarter. It's a significant cultural shift for us. Then going into a big room planning session, which is 1,500 people plus virtually coming together and planning out that work, is just a huge benefit for us. Now, it sounds a lot, I know, it sounds pretty complex, and it is, but we've found for us, we didn't want to do a little transformational shift. We wanted to do a seismic shift. We wanted to go to that next level of alignment. And then our third cadence in our quarterly delivery cycle is very much around coming together again, approving the delivery plans, greenlighting the funding, greenlighting any recruitment that's required in the session so that people are empowered to go out and start delivering on the plans that we agreed upon in the QBR memo. So I think for us, a huge cultural shift is probably the best way to describe it. And at the moment, it is definitely probably for us one of the best things we've actually done.
That's an amazing summary, Liam. You mentioned the QBR, and the second question we had for you as a prompt was, how did you get supporting functions? You mentioned finance in your discussion there. How did you bring them on board to support what is such a radically different process for so many people in the organisation?
I think the first thing to answer there is we had to get our executive team on board first.
Right.
So myself and we brought in Paul to come in, and we spent a lot of time. We spent about, I think, 7 full days designing at an organizational level what the model would look like and how we were going to operate. So we spent, a really significant amount of time in a period just before COVID to really get the team aligned, really get our executive team aligned, and also the top level org model done. So we were really pleased with that. And then I think the other tidbit that helped us a lot was very much around, we built a program. So one of the things that from day one that we did is we built a dedicated team to this transformation. We didn't have people part-time involved in the program. So we had our finance, our strategy, our people and our transformation teams full-time in this. So we brought people in from those teams. We brought in ADAPTOVATE to help us, and we had a dedicated team to deliver this, because for us, this seismic shift didn't require part-time leadership or part-time delivery. It really required a full-time focus. So first thing we did was build that, bring in our executives, and then very much bringing in our strategy, our finance, our people, and our transformation teams collectively together to enable this change is very important indeed. So for us, I think in terms of bringing our teams together, you need them as part of building and designing. So we did have our finance, strategy, people, and transformation all together, co-designing, co-building, co-deploying, and then co-embedding the transformation together, which really helped.
That's amazing. And in fact, it answers also one of the questions from Sav. Thank you, Sav, for listing that in the chat, where you've asked rightly, how did you know your tipping point to scale? And it sounds like you really did make that conscious decision, Liam, at a leadership level. Is that a fair assessment to respond to Sav's question? Did you'd made that clear decision that it was time to invest and time to make these major transformations?
We did. So we had an executive offsite in December last year, and we took a step back and we said, we've had a really great 3 years. We used to be the trailblazers in Agile for the group, and we stepped back and said, well, we want to reduce silos, we want to get greater alignment, greater transparency, and greater empowerment. So when we went into that offsite, we took in a lot of feedback from our teams and what they were frustrated with, what they were looking towards in terms of removing roadblocks for them. So when we came into that initial offsite, it was very much around what is it that we want to build that's going to be great for our customers first and foremost, aligned with our teams and the feedback they're giving us, and also that would fit perfectly with our business model and strategy. So those things were really important to us. So from there, we were then able to build and commit to the journey that we're about to get on and start to really build. So that was then incorporating a lot of the thoughts and feedback and experiences that Paul has had, really helped us to build confidence in what we wanted to do. And then we invested a lot of time in the design up front, but then we also brought in our teams, our practice leads and our tribal leads, to come in and help us co-create their individual areas as well. So there was quite a lot of co-creation as part of this process. We had COVID hit us. That was a bit of a challenge, and I think that's probably an important thing to point out, that we did have a fork in the road around, do we continue with this large scale transformation whilst COVID was impacting us as a grocery business? You could imagine the amount of focus for us in terms of dealing with COVID. So we did make a conscious effort to focus on COVID, and then we also made a conscious effort to focus also on our Agile transformation as well. So we did commit to both.
It's an extraordinary commitment given how widely reported and well respected the company's response to COVID has been. Thanks, Liam.
Thank you.
Darren, may I ask, as you have experienced the rollout in your teams for just over a year, as I understand it, it was a major transformation which you described in your introduction. The first specific question I'm asking to prompt a conversation is, how was the big elements of the change communicated to your teams, Darren?
Yeah, okay, so it is a big change management piece. And so we certainly invested a lot in the communication up front. And we had the ADAPTOVATE team, I think, on site for probably around 3 months. So the kind of things we did there, we actually had 2 Agile lounges. And so these were spaces on a floor that had big visuals that explained the model. And so it wasn't just push communications, but also the concept of having leaders in those lounges along with the ADAPTOVATE team where people come in and have a conversation about how it all works. So that was a big thing. The other thing is we invested heavily in coaches, in also having a partner in ADAPTOVATE to help with the transformation. And shortly afterwards, we started investing heavily in Scrum Masters. And so the way I think about that is the communication, and there's different channels of communication, but it's ultimately kind of a top-down, like it's how we get the messages out to the team. What's equally important is the bottom up of the coaches and the Scrum Masters we embedded across the squads actually leading the change. And I'd actually say that between the coaches and ADAPTOVATE and then creating this extra responsibility for Scrum Masters, which they love, they absolutely love, is really, really powerful, because you get this real, that's culture. That's the team actually leading the change. And it just goes to the point of servant leadership as well, where what we did was empower the teams with the practices, but then the coaches and the Scrum Masters actually took over. And probably the last thing in terms of communication is terminology. So I think, big change is terminology, and we probably underestimated that day one. We're talking about 400 people who, in our case, who've worked in a traditional environment with organizational charts and role descriptions, and we suddenly start talking about tribes and squads and chapters and practices and roles of Scrum Masters and retrospectives and backlog grooming. So it's very new. And if I fast forward just over 12 months, that is now completely natural. And I really believe in it. Like, we've seen the evidence of that, but the shift from a traditional model to that model and understanding the terminology and making those concepts real for people is a really key piece up front.
It's a great observation, Darren. I'm so grateful for you raising that, because I think the more accessible we are in terms of the language we use, the more effectively we can work. And I guess the question that follows from that is, you were merging two teams when you launched this operating model, some of whom had significant agile insight and knowledge and maturity, and others who were just starting out. The question that came to our minds was, how did you as a leadership team encourage that collaboration in a time of great change with differing levels of maturity in your teams?
Yeah, I think there's three key things. First of all, again, the role of the coaches. I mean, I often refer to the coaches as the heart of our agile culture, on the ground driving that. And so you can have, the way we manage that is we actually had 6 coaches who had a portfolio of tribes and squads. They were in the ceremonies and helping the teams get going. So whether they were a more mature squad who we wanted to focus on continuous improvement, or a new squad coming onto Agile, the coaches were able to tailor that, and they were really kind of that force on the ground that drove that change. The second thing was the onboarding of the squads, and this is really, really critical. And it goes back to the point Liam and Emma touched on as well around purpose. And so what we basically did is we went through an onboarding process for every squad, where the first thing is we determined what is our mission as a squad, what are our objectives. Off the back of that, we set our OKRs, and then we took that through to actually setting our day one backlog of work. So effectively the priorities. And that, having a team of people in a room talking about purpose and finding a common purpose, and we talk about servant leadership, actually allowing the team to come up with that. Now, of course, we're providing some guidance on the organization's strategic priorities, but what we found is they came up with purpose statements or mission statements that were very strongly aligned with customer outcomes. And so there's this really true sense of purpose that then drove all of that. And so even though we had new teams coming on, we put them through that onboarding process. And what came out the other side was a team that was clear on their purpose, really clear on their objectives and their OKRs, and really clear on their starting backlog of work. And then we got them into a rhythm from there. The other thing which Liam touched on, which is really powerful, is big room planning. And we've also had to do it virtually this year, although we had probably 2 cycles of doing it literally in a big room before it hit. And what happens there is a few things. It's powerful to get everyone in the room at the same time, hearing the same clarity and following, given the same space to plan and prioritize, but they also get to see each other. And so the less mature teams get to see the more mature teams, and they get excited about what they're doing. And so some of our teams were doing advanced prioritization using a methodology we have. are also very advanced in using data and customer insights to prioritize their backlog. And so other teams started looking at that and going, that's the next logical thing for us to introduce. And it also becomes kind of infectious, you know. So I think big room planning is a way to actually, your more mature teams play a mentoring role, and your newer teams look at them, actually get ideas, and they have that aspiration to kind of move up the maturity curve.
Well, that's a great response, because we often find that when we're joining organisations, those that are the best advisors are those that are within. They've got the experience, they understand it, and to your point, they coach and they guide. And it's great that they were so open and able to share with those who are new to Agile exactly, to your point, the estimation or the various techniques that can be used that are really going to drive the outcome for the customer. So thanks, Darren. May I turn now to the forum? We've got over 100 participants online, and we really do hope that we capture your questions, which at the moment are falling into two key categories. And I'll open this to yourself, Emma, Liam, and Darren to share the floor here. The first, I guess, style of questioning is around frameworks and models for examples. So I'm going to read some of these from the screen here. One of the examples used is SAFE, for instance. What model did you choose, is the question raised, and why did you choose it? If I could start with any responses on that particular question, if there was a specific model that you chose to embrace, or one that on reflection you might have drawn more upon. Happy to take a response from either yourself, Darren, Emma, or Liam.
I'm happy to kick off and then let Liam and Emma build on it. So I think, look, when it came to doing Agile at scale, we partnered with ADAPTOVATE, and it's such a good reflection seeing Paul's update earlier, because that was the theory that we spent time with the ADAPTOVATE team talking about, and now we've seen the evidence, and that is our new norm. So that is sort of broadly the framework. So basically, as Emma touched on, you have to have a clear organisational strategy. That cascades down to the QBR, which is basically a quarterly planning cycle. That then cascades down to the tribes and the squads and the actual prioritisation of backlogs. So that's, and then with a 2-week cadence around the sprint ceremonies. That's broadly the model, but I think the important point I would make is, and a number of people touched on this before, you have to personalise to a degree for the organisation. So we focused very, very much on the principles of that framework. And I noticed a question in the chat, for example, about what do you do with some teams where it doesn't make sense to move them to Agile Scrum, so the week sprint cadence, or it doesn't make sense to have them in some forums. And we found that a lot. And so the thing that really helped us is coming back to the principles of Agile, but you then overlay things like, how do we make sure that we've got the most efficient forums and our people are freed up to do the work and not, in meetings all the time? And so who needs to attend what types of ceremonies? One of the big things for us was we originally had, I think we found a challenge between the role of our chapter leads who are focused on people and capability development, and the role of our tribe lead and squad service owners, or normally called product owners, who are very much focused on commercial and prioritization. And you need to have the balance of those two to have a high performing team. We found we're all about getting stuff done and not spending enough time on building the skills and developing our people. And so we implemented sub-chapter lead roles. So effectively smaller teams of people who are actually in the squads doing the work, that had part of their time allocated to leading a team and focusing on building the skill set. And so you have to be prepared to make little adjustments like that. And there just has to be this pragmatic overlay of how do you apply those principles in a way that kind of understands your organisation and is going to be the most efficient way of working.
That's excellent, Darren. Liam, I know that you had some observations earlier when we were speaking about that fine mix that Darren's just described, of focusing, when you're developing your framework, on the delivery versus the capability and the practice building. Did you want to build on that and speak to us a little about your reflections on the time spent or the prioritisation of that as you were designing your model?
Absolutely. Firstly, we call it Wagile because it is a blend of philosophy. So we are not focusing on purely just one philosophy. And, you know, as Agilists, there's, as I've learned over the years, there's passion for scale and tribal, and never should the two meet. But I think that was really important for us. I think one of the refreshing things about, you know, and I don't often compliment Paul, so he should get one now, which is Paul comes in with a really commercial lens. And I think one of the challenges we've probably had is getting that commercial lens around Agile. So that's really helped us. And I think when we look at our model, when we built it, and I think there was a question around roles and so forth, we probably spent a lot of time on the tribal component, which was really important for us to do. We certainly spent a lot of time on the practice and chapter component as well. But I think one of the key learnings we've had through the process is making sure you're equally focusing your time, and in particular, the practices time on both the tribal and the practice worlds, because there is a beautiful balance there between the two, which is a challenge to do at first, because we fundamentally had team members who were very hierarchical and focusing on if I have people directly reporting into me, therefore that's a bit of a self-worth component to how I contribute. And one of the things that I myself and Paul spent a lot of time on in our transformation was actually capability and delivery are equally as important. So whether you are a practice lead and focusing on building capability, or a chapter lead, that is critical to really getting a very strong delivery culture. So for us, I think a key learning for us was to make sure that we constantly were focusing on the balancing between our focus, our language, and our effort on both the practice and the tribal worlds. And that is still something we're still working through. But for us, we really have gone down the road of both those worlds being equally important and equally requiring focus.
Thanks.
Leanne, it's Emma here. Oh, I was just going to say that really resonates. And I'm glad to hear, it's heartening to hear that, a year or two in, you're still dealing with this, because I find we're still trying to find that right balance as well. But to the point that Darren raised about kind of modifying Agile based on the practicalities of your organization, one of the things that I think we found was, given the way Visa is structured, you've got technology, which is actually a global function. And so there's a lot about Agile that really tries to influence technology builds. And just practically speaking, it's really hard to do that from a market. And so we kind of over-index on some of the more, the earlier stages of Agile, if you will, knowing that we're gonna need to get our sea legs before we're able to convince technology to come and work with us in the same way. So it's kind of having an appreciation of what you can influence in the near term, and a plan for building that influence over time.
I love the concept of influence that you raise, Emma, because it fits neatly into some of the questions that have been raised in the chat, which is, how do you influence those who aren't keen on the concept of Agile throughout the organisation? And also a question around, how do you influence those and prepare people when they're doing something very new? So the virtual planning was an example used there. Open to the floor as to who would like to answer the tough question of how do you influence those who may not be so supportive of the concept, or perhaps how do you promote the why?
I think for us, I'll kick off and then quickly jump. I think for us, the why was critical, and we spent a lot of time on that, but we used data points. So when we built the why, we built it with our voice of team and the verbatims in our voice of team, our stakeholders and what they were saying, our customer data. All of that really helped us to look at what the why and how we did it, and making sure that we were inclusive around the feedback that we were receiving for the purpose as to why we were going to make this change. I think that was first thing, and that was the most critical thing around creating the why, and then being clear on what that was. So when we did talk to a stakeholder in Woolworths Group, or to one of our team members, or to a member that supports us from a partnership perspective, they felt like it resonated with them, because we incorporated the feedback and the voices that support our business. So for me, it was incorporating the feedback and the voices of the people that work with WooliesX or in WooliesX that helped to resonate on the why for them.
It's a great insight. And Darren, for you, would you agree that the why was clear, or in your experience? I recall
Absolutely.
a scenario at the lounge one day when you were communicating the change, where there was someone who was initially uncertain, and I vividly recall your conversation was quite influential on that day.
Yeah, look, the why is very important. I mean, I think across all of our businesses, I think we have smart people who are purpose-driven people. We hire people who are capable and have strong values, and so unless they understand that purpose, it's going to be really challenging. So I think taking the time to explain that, then the question becomes whether it's the executive, convincing the executive team or convincing the team themselves. How do you do that? I remember I was kind of frustrated when I first heard about Agile, that it was all about, you've got to convince the executive, you've got to get everyone on board. Well, but how do you do that is the question. And so the two things, like my two tips on that are, first of all, evidence-based. So there is a lot of evidence now in organisations who've worked that way. There is a huge amount of evidence out there around that. And I think whenever you're having a fact-based discussion, it's powerful. The second thing, and another way to actually gather evidence, is a pilot. And my tip there would be, do a pilot, but do one that is highly visible. And so in our case, we picked a part of our business, which is the business that insures our customers' homes, right? So pretty critical. And Westpac we've got fairly low market share relative to our overall banking market share. So we picked that one, we put a massive target on it, and we made it a high profile pilot. Now that's kind of risky, but what it did is basically take an important part of our business, and this was pre-COVID, now we'd have to do it virtually, but we had a section of our office that was highly visible to executives and to the team, and that was where their board was. And it created this buzz around it. And so then within about a 6-week period, we were able to demonstrate a number of things, increase in the team output, some really early results around lifting our digital applications, or our online applications. And so I think, piloting, but pick the pilot carefully and make it highly visible.
Fantastic. Emma, may I ask, I know you're just at the beginning as we speak, and visibility is often difficult to track, but in your closing comments before we close for the evening, did you have any final thoughts of encouragement, or is it something we'd be able to invite you to watch this space and come back and report again? Open to your thoughts as we close the webinar for the evening.
Yeah, absolutely. So listen, I think we've been really, really pleased with the early successes we've seen. And couldn't agree more with what's just been said. I think we've tried to, the whole concept of piloting and making it visible and making sure that you're creating that groundswell of believers is really important. And I love the idea of a board. I wish we had something that was more tangible and we could be in the office together. But the other thing I'll maybe just say is embrace the skeptics. And it's really good to have skeptics and healthy debate, because it ultimately makes what you create better and more fit for purpose. So don't be disheartened by folks that don't buy in initially. Take that feedback on board and incorporate it into what you're doing. But I think as long as you have that agreement to commit and to move in this direction, because there is a ton of evidence to that, of how successful this stuff is, I think you'll be in a good place. But just don't be disheartened, because you'll always have skeptics, but it's good to welcome them.
That's a fantastic way to close, Emma. Real words of encouragement. And can I please thank, on behalf of everybody here, our magnificent panelists, Emma, Liam and Darren, for your generous insights from a leadership perspective, and for sharing that after what has been such a significant year for all leaders globally. May I say that ADAPTOVATE is a global Agile consulting company. We do specialise in scaling Agile ways of working and embedding sustainable change around the world with 50 Agile consultants and coaches. Please feel free to reach out to us at any time. Thank you so much for attending today. We would love you to join us on social media. We're very active on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And stay tuned for some really great, interesting sessions to follow. Thank you again to all of our panelists and for all of the registrants. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you join us today.